Hey there! I just spent the last few weeks shooting and editing a reel of spatial video clips playable in the Apple Vision Pro and MetaQuest 3 at the moment. And the post-production process was challenging to say the least. So I thought I'd put together a little video to show you some of the steps involved in turning dual fisheye or side-by-side footage into spatial video. So one thing I want to mention is that shooting video on a professional rig gets you much higher quality than if you were to shoot it on the iPhone or on the Apple Vision Pro itself. Not only does a professional camera have a larger sensor, more dynamic range, less compression, but the main benefit is that on what I used, the Canon R5C with dual fisheye lens, you have an IPD or distance between the lenses of 60 millimeters, which is much closer to what the human eyes see. The two cameras on the front of the Apple iPhone are obviously, much closer together than that, so you get less of a 3D effect. And then the cameras on the Apple Vision Pro are of lower quality. Not to mention that wearing cameras on your face is inherently unstable, and it's difficult to keep things level as well. So shaky, unstable, poor cameras. There's just no really good and easy way to shoot spatial video yet. So shooting spatial video with the R5C was very interesting. There's a lot of additional things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, it requires extra power in order to run the lens, so the battery in the camera doesn't provide enough power for some reason to also adjust the aperture on the lens. You have to plug the camera into a battery pack with USB-C. The other issue I ran into right away is that the memory needs for this kind of footage are pretty intense. I was shooting the R5C in 8K, 60 frames per second in Canon RAW Light, and that netted me about 6 minutes of footage per 128 gig card. So I would definitely recommend getting larger cards. Another thing you have to keep track of when shooting 3D video is the camera itself has to be very level. So any kind of disparity in the leveling of the camera will affect the 3D and make it kind of pop less and could even cause headaches. Another thing you want to think about is camera movement. That is, you probably don't want to do as much of it. In my reel, I have a number of things that were shot on the gimbal, and I can't say that that was an entirely effective way to do things. I myself don't get motion sickness from watching this stuff, but I know some people do. So generally no movement, and if you are going to do some movement, I would keep it very minimal. One last issue I ran into while shooting this was monitoring the stuff. On the back of the camera for the R5C, you get the dual fisheye look, but picking apart if something is in focus was very difficult for that. So I would recommend like a 7-inch monitor or bigger in order to really see if what you're shooting is in focus. So I learned quickly after starting to work with these files that it helped a lot if the individual files had more descriptive names than the serialized numbers that they get in the camera. I divided the clips into different scenes, and then in addition, I numbered those clips. For that, I use something called Name Changer. So it's a free utility that you can find online, and you just kind of bring everything into it, and then you can append a number or sequence a number right here. This utility is great for automating those name changing functions, so you don't have to sit there and find or manually change everything yourself. So before we really get into the post-production, I wanted to call out this YouTube channel by HuHu. Such amazing tutorials. This guy is a pillar of the spatial 3D 180 filmmaking kind of community. He's always deep in the comments helping people out, and I wouldn't have been able to get remotely as far as I have if it wasn't for some of his tutorials. This one right here in particular is where I learned most of what I'm going to be showing you today. I must have watched this, 15, 20 times just to get through the process. But there's a few things in there that I thought I might be able to make even better. In order to process the raw footage into 180 3D side-by-side, we'll need a piece of software called Mystica VR. So this is the website for Mystica VR. It's published by a company called SGO, and the version of this that we're going to be using is Mystica VR. So this does cost money, about 70 bucks a month, and you're going to need the professional edition. So once you have that downloaded and installed, let's go ahead and open it up and create a new project. So I'm going to call this tutorial, and we're going to give it the format of 8192 by 4096 with the frame rate of 5994. That's the frame rate that the Canon VR shoots in, and for immersive stuff, more frames is better. So we've got a blank interface here. We're going to go back over to Finder, and I'm going to pick one of these clips and drag it in to the sidebar here. Continue. And there we go. We've got the clip inside of Mystica VR, and you can see what it looks like straight out of camera. If you look really closely here on the sides, you can actually see the other VR lens in the shot. Here's one over here as well. One mistake I made when shooting this initially was I was doing my best to keep the tripod out of the shot. It turns out that you end up framing a lot of what's at the bottom and top of the frame out anyways. So I wouldn't say that you shouldn't worry about tripods at all, but just know that if something does make it into the corner of a shot, it's not the end of the world. There's a lot of different panels down here, and we're not going to be working in all of them, just a few. But in order to get things started, the first thing we want to do is to load up a preset. What that's going to do essentially is to divide this shot into two separate clips. We can see up here in the bin, for lack of a better term, that it's treating this as just one shot. So I'm going to right-click on this and go to Load Preset. And conveniently, there is a preset here for the Canon dual fisheye lens. So the name of the preset is Canon RF dual fisheye. Go ahead and select that. It's going to take a while to think about it. And down here in the viewer, I have black and white anaglyph selected. So we are going to leave that on black and white anaglyph actually for a minute. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, and there's a few options here at this first panel, you want to turn off optical flow, and you want to turn off the stitch feather as well. So we're going to change this from 8 to 0 and make sure that both of those things are off. So for rendering options, we're going to choose a custom output resolution of 4096 by 2160. Vignetting we can ignore, optical flow we can ignore because we turned that off. Next is camera defaults. So for the Canon R5C, you should be shooting in log. So you want to make sure that that information is being passed through and not affected at all by Mystica VR. So we're going to tell it that we're shooting in log, Canon log 3 in my case, and the input gamma is Canon Cinema Gamut. We're going to leave the rest of that alone, and we're going to go back over here to output camera, and we're going to make sure that both of those things are the same value. Canon log 3, output gamma, Canon Cinema Gamut. Next, go into mapping and select planar rectangular. This is going to get you much more normal looking footage. So just like if you were to correct the fisheye in a GoPro, it makes those curved lines straight. So at this point, what I would recommend is saving this as a preset. Go up to Scene and Save Preset. I'm just going to call this New Canon. This way, if we're working with multiple clips, we don't have to change all those things individually one at a time. You can just load the correct preset and be halfway there. So you can tell here that we are a little bit too punched in. If we go to the focal length down here and change that value, then we get something a lot closer to the field of view we wanted in the first place. Now there's a lot of other controls here for the framing. You can pan left and right inside of the shot. You can pitch up and down inside of the shot. And you can also truck up and down and dolly left and right. And these will all give you different chunks of the frame. So there's a lot of controls here, and it's important to get this right because exporting out of here is the most compute intensive part of the process. So I played with some of these other controls down here, and to be honest, I'm not exactly certain what they do. I stick with yaw, pitch, focal length, offset X, and offset Y. You want to really leave all these color grading controls alone. That we're going to take care of later in DaVinci. So the next thing we want to do, once we have our framing pretty much set, is to select this button right here, and then this one right over here, which is going to give us just one eye, and it's going to give us the original circle. This is letting us decide what the center of the fisheye frame is. You can see that this is a little bit off as is. So once we have that yellow circle in frame, you click and drag and just try to center it up. In my experience, it's not ever going to be kind of perfect. It always looks like there's part of it that's kind of poking out. You can see here, you know, the frame kind of ends right there. Some of the other fisheye is taking up a kind of big chunk of this. But get it as close to the middle as you can and watch the edges just to make sure that not too much overlap is happening there. Once you have the center set, you can turn this off and this off. And then the next step is to use Mystica VR's auto calibration features down here. So we go to color, match color. This is going to look at each image and try to calibrate the color so that they match. Sometimes one eye or lens can be a bit more magenta or a bit more green, and so this kind of fixes that. Then the next thing we're going to do is go to Stitch, Auto Calibrate. And then for this we want to change mode to VR 180. Everything else can stay the same, and calibrate. This is super important. If there is any kind of vertical disparity between the two images, when you bring them together, the 3D will be a bit broken. My understanding is that this step is the biggest thing that Mystica VR brings to the table. Being able to calibrate the VR out of one of these cameras is extremely important and very difficult to do manually. So that's it. Once we've got all those things set, we can go to File and Render. Now, one thing I learned the hard way working with this software is that you cannot put an underscore in the name. I spent hours fighting the software, setting up a shot, and then going to hit render only for nothing to happen. Next, you're going to want to pick the output format. I go with QuickTime ProRes and make the codec just regular ProRes. We're going to be doing more things and coding the clip a couple more times. So it's best to make it a lossless format. Just need to jump in here with a quick correction. The stereo setting here underneath codec, very importantly, needs to be set to left/right. Next is the output size. I played with this in a few different ways and ended up just leaving this on auto. That seems to get me the resolution that I'm looking for. Audio is another one. You can choose for the audio to be in a separate sidecar file or as part of the movie. For my purposes, I just left this as none. So once this looks right, go ahead and hit render and be prepared to wait. For this clip, which is 37 seconds long, we're looking at about a 15-minute render time. So once you get the footage out of Mystica VR, you're going to get a gigantic ProRes file in 3D 180 side by side, which looks like this. So you can see this is obviously shot in a log format. So we're going to want to fire up DaVinci Resolve and bring it into there. File management is super important in a project like this because you're going to create a lot of different files bouncing back and forth between different pieces of software. You can see here in Finder that my exports are named the same thing as the raw video clips. If I had to do this again, I would leave out the underscore because it did not like that. Once I send things out of DaVinci, I append the name with the word color. And then once I've rolled that into a spatial video, I add the word spatial. So this is a spatial export. So once we have all of our clips in DaVinci, we're going to go to New, Timeline. And instead of using the project settings, we're going to go to Format. We're going to set the timeline resolution to Custom. And For the ones that we have here in the bin, I exported at 7680 by 2160, which is 3840 by 2160 side by side. And then the timeline frame rate is going to be 59.94. DaVinci does not like using mixed frame rates, so make sure when you're first setting up the project that it's 59.94. It'll save you a lot of problems in the future. So go ahead and create that. I'm going to call this tutorial. And we're going to drag our clip into it. So there you go. Now that we have it in DaVinci, we can color grade it. And I believe in these, I ended up using a different preset quite a bit of the time. I just wasn't getting the desired look with a Canon LUT. So let's see, I ended up using Panasonic Vlog to V-709. Your mileage may vary on that. Perhaps it's best to start with the Canon LUT. So your LUT should be applied near the end of the process. I always try to do exposure and color cast on different nodes. So I've got my curves here, and make it look a little bit nicer. So this you could spend hours and hours in. I'm just doing some basic adjustments here. And then on my last node down here, I added noise reduction. This one is turned off because it's very processor intensive. So you can see here, I'm able to play the clip back. If I turn on noise reduction, very slow to play back. Great, so we've color graded everything in DaVinci. One thing to keep in mind is that you cannot do any of these transform controls. You will immediately break your 3D. There's ways to keyframe the framing in Mystica VR so that we're panning up and down, left and right inside of that 180 frame. But once you get to this part of the process, the framing is set and cannot be adjusted. So we're going to go ahead and set our out points and export this. There's a few different pieces of software for turning 3D 180 side by side into spatial video, and none of them are great so far. There's no Apple solution to this. There's just seems to be a bunch of fly-by-night apps that have just been put out lately. When I first started doing this, one of the only ways to turn video into spatial was via terminal command. So as limited as the options are, it's better than it was a month ago. For this tutorial, we're going to encode as H.265 at the source resolution at the source frame rate. This part of the process is also going to take a while. For a 37-second clip, looking at about 10 minutes for export. So once we have everything exported, we're going to turn that into spatial video. The one that I ended up using the most was Spatial Encoder. You can find that on the App Store. I believe it was either free or $5, something small like that. So this piece of software doesn't have many options, but we want to select full side-by-side. The tutorial here, I'm going to choose a different clip. So we're going to use this one right here, drag it into there, and that's it. It gives you the option of file format, but I believe that's just the wrapper. So this doesn't seem to affect the quality of the video that you get out of it, just the extension. And there you have it. Once you're done, you get an MP4 out of the process that's spatial video. And this doesn't look like anything different here, but that's one of the cool things about spatial video is that if you play them on anything else that's not a headset, it appears like a totally normal MP4. So there you have it. It's a time-intensive, multi-step process. But if you want to get professional-looking spatial video into a headset, right now, that's the best way to do it. If you have any questions, get in touch.